All right. Good evening, everyone. I hope I'm audible to everyone. Let me just once confirm this. All right. So, good evening, everyone. Let's talk about today's class. We'll get started shortly. So, few things that I wanted to discuss beforehand is I've already taken a few of these sessions. Some of you may have attended them before. After today's session, once you're done with today's session, if you haven't attended the previous classes, go take a look at those classes. I've taken RCs. The sources of the RCs are actually from places where CAT asks us questions from, such as Eon, The Guardian, etc. Right? And I've taken these RCs and created questions from them, and I think they'll be of immense value to you. So please go through those previous classes. If you don't want to attend the class, that's fine, but just simply look at the RC that is there in the previous videos and try and solve it, right? Uh, which brings me to this current point. Let me just give me a moment. Those of you who are here, please drop in a comment so I know that you're here and I can address you, and then we can ask questions and we can discuss this. This is important right now because we have a few months left for the exam. I think it's very important that all of you all get your doubts sorted and get it clear as to the reading process or how to get better at VRC, any of those things, because it's going to be of value to you, and this is the right moment to actually ask in the run up to the exam. Uh, I also expect by now students to have a little bit of more experience than they had before in terms of looking at RCs, solving RCs. Good evening, Tushar. Uh, the thing is that since you have a little bit of experience by now, you should have some clarity about what is your strength, what is your weakness, how to address certain passages which are your strengths and weaknesses. So do ask me questions with regards to that. Okay. Now, which brings me to my point, which is today's RC is from Eon. The word count is around 590 onwards. We can expect passages of this length. Okay. Now, the point that I want to make, and this is why I said that you should look at the prior classes, is remember that for us to get better at VRC, we are essentially learning to read in a specific way. What does this mean? And this is a little difficult for me to impart and for you to absorb also. The reason is all of us have a reading process going on in our head, and it's an intuitive reading process that we developed in childhood. That's not the specific reading that the exam requires you to do. Right? The exam requires you to do a very specific kind of reading, which is what I've practiced in the prior classes that I've taken, and which is what I'll be discussing today. So, what is this specific form of reading? How can I get better at it? And what approach do I use? Okay. So, first, let's think of this in a more simplified fashion, right? What is expected out of us is to simplify and evaluate. Now, think of simplify first from the point of view that we are not going to get any context or frame of reference, right? We aren't going to get any title, we aren't going to get any subtitle, we are just going to get a passage, right? Not just this topic is unknown to us. Oftentimes the topic is difficult, the topic is new, maybe it's a new concept that has recently been in the news. So all of this requires us to simplify, right? Different passages, let's say RC1, RC2, RC3, different passages require different amount of simplification. This is obvious, but the reason why I'm mentioning this is we feel कि यार passage तो 6 मिनट में होना चाहिए या 8 मिनट में होना चाहिए. Some formulaic assumptions we make. That's not the case. Different passages, different amount of input required, right? For evaluation also, different amount of input required from us. Okay, so keep this idea in mind. We have information without context, and we are supposed to simplify it, and then we are supposed to evaluate it. If we get better at these skills, our VRC scores are going to be great, right? Now, how do we get better at these skills? How do I ensure that I read for the exam, right? Not just how I read intuitively in my mind, I read for the exam. Just one moment, right? Okay. So the thing that I want all of you to keep in mind when you're reading for the exam is, think of it in this fashion. When you have the passage in front of you, this is like a bar graph question. Okay. Now you're going to get questions asked from a bar graph also, and you're going to get questions asked from a passage also. So the reason why I want you to compare it to this type of a question is, don't try and retain information. A lot of us, mess up the reading process by trying to remember or retain information. You don't try and retain the graph, right? You, based on the question, you go back to the passage, you go back to the graph, you check specifically what is being discussed, then you make a calculation and then you answer the question. The same process applies for RCs. Do not try to retain the passage. This takes up 4 times the amount of energy and students lose focus. Students don't know what is happening. So instead, what I want you to try and do is, I just want you to break down the passage into chunks and figure out overall in your reading process, right, why the author is talking to you. Notice this is not what the author is talking about. This is very easy. This is what we usually try and remember. This is just a bunch of information. This doesn't tell me why the author wants to use up my time. The author, when I say why, this tells me from each sentence what was the purpose or objective behind that sentence. Correct? This sounds like a very simple thing, but I want you to truly practice and develop this. This is going to change how you read the RC. This is going to change how you get clarity about the RC. Okay, so keep this idea in mind. We're learning from each sentence to ask why the author has given that sentence to us. That will give us the purpose of that sentence. That will give us the objective of that sentence. Keep this idea in mind. We're going to see it in today's class and it's going to be handy. It's going to come it's going to be of great use to us. So keep this idea in mind along with this thing, which is about topic A, author says B. If we can break down all the questions in the exam to this degree, which is about a certain topic, the author says something specific, right? You put A and B together, you get basically why the author wanted to take up your time. There is a specific topic the author wants to discuss. About that topic, the author wants us to know something specific. The reason why a lot of students get confused about questions like main point, about questions like why is the author talking to you, this can be asked different ways. But the reason why students get confused about these things is because students end up focusing on just topic. This is very easy for us to observe, and this is not as important as us putting together what about the topic the author is specifically trying to tell us, right? By what, I'm not saying gather facts here, but there is a specific purpose this topic was given to us, right? Figure out why that purpose was. What was the author's purpose? Okay. Now I'm going to show you a passage and I'm going to wait for a few minutes. Please go through the passage, read it, figure out what that passage is trying to say in terms of this, and then we'll see the questions. Correct? But remember, while reading the passage, you are not trying to retain the passage. The passage is going to stay in front of you. What you're in fact going to try and do is figure out why the author spoke to you. Now, Tushar, others also, some of you may prefer and enjoy reading from uh, a word file. So I'm just giving you a word file in the chat window. Please open this, Tushar, Aru, please open this link and get the passage, and maybe you can read from it if you prefer to read from it. Okay, so let's get started with the passage, everyone. Okay, so I'm just going to wait for somewhere around 3.5 4 minutes. Please get started and I'll then resume discussing this passage. All right. So that's somewhere close to 4.5 minutes. Uh, so let me get back to what we are supposed to achieve from this reading process. One is I asked you not to retain information. I'll explain this further soon. The other thing that I wanted to tell you was that we have to gather why the author is talking to us. This we can do by figuring out what the topic of the author is and what about the topic does the author say specifically. Okay. So now I'm going to show you how I fill these blanks. Okay. Then I'm going to describe my reading process to you. And that's the part that I wanted to pay careful attention to. We have 4 questions coming up, which we'll discuss. But first, please try and pay attention to the reading process that I'm going to apply. Right. So first, let's look at how we can fill blank A about topic intelligence in plants, right? Whether there is intelligence in plants, yes or no. And about this topic in general, the author says it is perfectly possible to provide definitions of intelligence that apply to plant behavior, right? Now, the reason why I've chosen these words is categorically is I've chosen words from the passage. Now, this is important. If I was to start describing, right? If I was to start describing my description here, then we are very error prone, right? We'll end up making mistakes. So this I don't want you to construct in the exam, by the way. All I want you to think is when you read the passage, you can point to certain aspects which will tell you what the main point of the author is, right? So it is perfectly possible to provide intelligence that definitions of intelligence that apply to plant behavior, right? And if you notice, the author discusses different definitions here, whether the how this impacts the concept of intelligence according to philosophy, and then some examples are provided later, right? We'll get to the details in the reading part about it, but what I want to point out is this is blank A, this is blank B. Both these sentences, both these phrases are taken from the actual words that the author has used. This is important. I don't want to describe it, you shouldn't describe it, because that way we make errors. So we will rely on evidence being the author's actual words. Now, the other thing that I want to tell you is let's take a look at the passage. But for a moment, I want you to think about how the actual reading process plays out in our minds, right? When you read the sentence for the first time, forget the words that I've marked for now. Don't pay attention to those. I'll discuss those. When we read a sentence for the first time, our mind is trying to essentially figure out what that sentence is. So we'll need to read it once, and only in the second reading, this is important. A lot of us feel that we should read from start to end and retain everything and answer questions which are, critical reasoning type of questions from this. This is, in most cases, for most passages, this is impossible, right? What we want to do is in the second reading of the sentence, we want to make sure that we have simplified it, which means in the second reading of the sentence, I'm going to skip a lot of words, right? I'm going to read selectively. Notice this is not something that we usually do, which is what I mean that for the exam, we read in a specific way. I'm trying to figure out why the first paragraph was given, why the second paragraph was given, why the third and why the fourth, right? I'm not much interested in the details of the examples. Okay. All right. Yes, and like Aru is saying and others are saying, I'm so used to retaining information. Think of it like this is a very specific thing that the exam requires, right? You can't use your own reading process for the exam. Then the timelines shift. If I want to retain information from the passage, we'll end up, adding 4 or 5 more minutes to it. And we know, like we've done retention sort of memorizing things in school. We know it takes a lot of time. Okay. So let me explain to you how to simplify in each sentence. So if you notice, we pay specific attention to certain terms. The redefinition of terms associated with philosophy is being done to interpret plant behavior, right? These terms I'm not really interested in right now, because I'm just trying to know why the author has given me the first paragraph. The author is saying some philosophical terms are being reinterpreted for plant behavior, right? Then notice how long the second sentence was. Sentence length is a big factor because we tend to lose track of what the subject of the author is. So sentence length is a big factor in terms of us trying to figure it out. Usually longer sentences become very difficult for us. So read them in chunks and omit a lot of things. So the idea of plant intelligence is central to this. If we begin with the presumption that intelligence is an exclusive feature of animal behavior, then the author says that this will mean we'll dismiss the idea of plant intelligence. Correct? If we presume that intelligence is exclusively animal, then we will dismiss the idea of plant intelligence. Notice how I've skipped the middle parts of the sentence while doing this. Right? Advocates of plant intelligence are on strong ground, though, in denying that presumption. So the author is saying this presumption is wrong. Presumption that intelligence is exclusively animal is incorrect. Right? Now the words that I've marked in green is for a reread. This doesn't work in the exam. I just want to tell you how we can simplify the main point of the first paragraph, main point of the second paragraph, main point of the third and fourth, and then sort of piece together this information. Right? So now I know why the first paragraph is given. The first paragraph is given to tell us some philosophical terms are being reshaped based on intelligence in plants. Correct? This is the why of the first paragraph. Let's look at the second paragraph. It is perfectly possible to provide definitions of intelligence that apply to plant behavior. Then the author tells us if intelligence for biological individuals is defined as adaptively variable behaviors. All of this is very long. Instead, the author is using someone's else's authority. We presume this person is an expert. Someone else's authority to define plant intelligence, which is adaptively variable behavior during the lifetime of the individual. Correct? So plant intelligence, one of the definitions is adaptively variable behavior during the lifetime of an individual plant. Correct? Now, examples are given where roots change based on how much water they get, plants shift based on how much light they get, and they release chemicals to ward off predators. Correct? Let's look at the third paragraph. So we have figured out why. Right? Here it's to tell us that intelligence exists in plants. And this is a change in the philosophy associated with certain terms. Then the author provides us a definition: adaptively variable behavior during the lifetime of an individual. So why is because the author is now giving us a definition. Now in the third paragraph, the author tells us the general definition of intelligence used here is basically it treats intelligence as an axiomatic starting point for the investigation of plant behavior in general. Basically, it's saying that here anything that survives, any animal that survives, therefore is intelligent. Right? So the author says here actually the debate is not about whether plants have intelligence or not in this case. The debate is more about a philosophical question: what is intelligence? Can I say a virus which survives, is this also intelligent? Right? So the author is now casting doubts about the way intelligence is framed in terms of this definition. Okay. Now let's look at the last paragraph. So we know why each paragraph so far has been given. Here the author is questioning the philosophical concept of intelligence. Can this apply to plants? Can this definition apply to plants? Then in the third paragraph, the author adds another thing to this concept of plant intelligence. Right? The author says plant intelligence requires us to think of plants as agents. What does this mean? Evidence that plants are agents, that they act purposefully, right, is based on certain behaviors. We know they act purposefully, and this would tell us that plants are actually agents. And of course, this is followed with certain examples. If you read the examples carefully, in one condition, plants reacted differently. The same plant reacted to different conditions differently, and another set of conditions differently, right? This tells us that plants are agents. So in short, the author is telling us there is intelligence in plants, perfectly possible to provide definitions of intelligence. Now, if I add details to it, the author questions certain definitions, and the author also adds more to these definitions by saying agent or agency, etc. Right? So this is in short the passage. Sir, are two reads enough? What if I get stuck on one sentence? What should I do then? This is a good question. By the way, when I say two readings, no, again, I'm being formulaic. Some sentences will require more readings. For example, this part, many students would have to read this thrice, right? But if I keep asking why that part is given, then it's very easy for me to skip it, right? The reason why I know I've skipped this part, for example, is to tell you that general definition of intelligence used here. Now, the author I know is commenting on the general definition of intelligence used here, right? The author is essentially telling me that this could be related simply to survival. Anything that survives, therefore, has intelligence. Now, what I go instead to, after skipping this, after maybe two readings, I skip this because I know why this is being given. I just go to the last part where the author is saying philosophy is baked into this kind of plant science. Basically, if you call plants intelligent, sorry, right? If you call plants intelligent, then you are essentially making a philosophical comment about plants. This is why the second paragraph was given to us, to tell us that this definition of intelligence is possibly problematic. So again, someone, whoever asked that doubt, ki, getting stuck at sentences, do I read two sentences, or do I read sentences twice? Different sentences you have to invest different amount of time, by the way. Okay, and remember that your after after the input of all the possible words, which happens in, let's say, one reading, don't retain them. After the input of all the possible words in your head, all we need to do is be selective about the second reading, right? Which words do I read and pay attention to? And most of the times, that selectiveness is us paying attention to the subject of the sentence, कि author का topic क्या है, right? And about that topic, what the author is saying. I'm actually skipping a lot of the difficult words, correct? Otherwise, I can't simplify in time enough. If I start retaining all the information, then it becomes very hard. Now, I'll tell you another thing, right? Which is key. Why don't I need to retain information? Because if a question is asked, just like I told you initially, treat this like a bar graph question. If a question is asked, we know exactly where to go and check in a graph. Similarly, if I told you a question about roots, I know that all of you visually know where possibly this information is located. It's probably located here or here, correct? Because our mind naturally remembers locations easily. This is a natural thing, right, to all of us, for survival, again, to do with intelligence, but that's separate. In any case, our mind will remember the location. So when a question with regards to something comes, we have to go back to that location, and just like I told you here, we'll have to check and solve it. Okay, so this is how we go through the passage, this is how we read. And I know that there are some questions associated with reading that people are asking, and you can continue to ask them. Let's start with some questions, right? uh, I'll just tell you what the title of the article is. Seeing plants anew. This doesn't really help us because this is taken from a third of the passage, right? But I just wanted to tell you this because if you want to go later and read this, and this is the author of the passage. Okay, so let's do a few questions. I just want all of you to go through it and type your answers. I'll discuss the logic behind how to solve them. Let's get started. This is your first question. I'll just wait for a while. All right. Those of you who can type in answers by now, please type in answers. Some of you have already correctly typed the answers out. Okay. So, and I mean, whatever are your answers, type them out, right? Don't hold back. This is the time to actually discuss and get your doubts sorted. Now, remember what I told you. The question is going to prompt us where in the passage to look. Which of the following most accurately reflects the reason why? So, which of the following basically tells us why philosophy is considered integral to plants or plant behavior, right? Now, we know the author here mentioned philosophy and plants, didn't necessarily tell us why it's integral, right? Instead, told us why plants can be considered as intelligence and it's not like animals, right? The author said it's not like animal behavior. So, this is why the first paragraph was given. Didn't tell us why philosophy is integral. Second paragraph gave us a definition, no mention of philosophy in second paragraph. Second paragraph gave us a definition of intelligence, which is adaptive variable behavior during the lifetime of the individual. And we know it's the third paragraph which told us philosophy is baked into this kind of plant science. So why is philosophy baked into, would we basically understand this to mean integral or really closely related to plant science? Why? Because it's a philosophical question. What is intelligence? So why is philosophy integral? Philosophy is integral because philosophy will measure, are plants intelligent? Right? Philosophy will measure, are plants intelligent? This is now, if you notice, I've read the question. I'm not simply going to the options. Remember in the exam, throughout your VRC, remember this. This can be trusted, right? This cannot be trusted. These are all possible traps. So, what I want you to think of is figure out get a correct, or let's say, get a accurate understanding or image of this in your mind when a question is asked first. Then proceed to the options. A lot of times, what happens, we read the question and we run to the options, and then we take this khichdi back to the passage, and then we're all confused, right? So, be very methodical in the solving process. So, now I know philosophy is being used to ask of plants, are they intelligent? So, let's look at A, redefining intelligence for non neural organisms, which is possibly talking about plants, is a philosophical challenge. So far, so good. It is a philosophical challenge. It's asking us a controversial question: ki, is this intelligence or not? To traditional mind matter separation. This is not discussed in the passage. Whatever this is has not been discussed in the passage. So I know the exact reason which makes option A incorrect. Notice this: we need specific reasons why an option is correct or incorrect. Let's look at option B. The plant intelligence debate focuses more on empirical evidence, focuses more on a certain kind of evidence. This is not discussed in the passage, that this debate focuses more on a certain kind of evidence. So, first is this fact is not stated, invalid. It's not telling us why philosophy is integral. Second, making philosophy a postscript to scientific discussion. Postscript means like a addendum, or means like a general thing that we'll discuss later. But here philosophy is considered important to plant science. So postscript would be incorrect. So we have two reasons in option B to declare it as incorrect. First is this focuses more on certain kind of evidence. If you didn't know, empirical. Second is postscript, right? And neither of options A and B are telling us why philosophy is integral to plant science, correct? Let's look at option C. Classifying plant behaviors as intelligent involves philosophical reasoning about the nature of intelligence. Philosophical question: what is intelligence? Right? This is what option C tells us. This is most probably the correct choice. I just need to confirm with option D once. Maybe option D is a better answer, right? Most implies that maybe option D can indeed be a better answer. Philosophy guides the scientific methodology. This guiding part not discussed, used to measure and quantify adaptive plant behavior. So completely incorrect. C is the correct choice for this question. All right. Empirical evidence means evidence that is, let's say, for lack of a better word, tactile evidence that you can touch and measure and gather. Right? You can gather that evidence. So, measurable, quantifiable evidence. But there is no such focus in the passage on a certain kind of evidence. The other thing that I want to tell you from this doubt that someone has asked is that अगर option में if a word comes which is not known to you, instead of worrying about I don't know what this means, think of does the intelligence debate focus more on X type of evidence? And we know there's no such thing that a certain kind of evidence is preferred over another kind of evidence. This has not happened in the passage. Right? So even though I didn't know empirical, I can still answer that question. C is the right choice here. Let's see the next question. Again, I'll pause. Please go through this and type in your answers. That's right. Our last paragraph talks about evidences, but not about one kind of evidence is better than another kind of evidence. And LB, you're right. Just focus on the passage, information given in the passage. Don't use your own knowledge, especially don't use your own opinions, because questions will be made in a confusing way where they'll try and mess with our understanding of the passage. Okay. So our understanding of that information, right? If there's a concept on, let's say, economics and inflation, if I have a certain opinion on it, I have to make sure that I won't use it while solving the passage or the questions. All right. All right. This is a really tricky question type. So I'll explain the question type quickly and then I'll get to discussing this specific question. Isme, just remember which of the following if true. This means we have to consider these as true facts. If lagaya hai because these facts are not mentioned in the passage. None of them are mentioned in the passage. But we have to consider them as true. If they are true, then we want to check whether how they'll affect Trevas's argument. Okay, or the argument. Sometimes this argument is replaced by opinion, conclusion, something else, right? It doesn't matter, but we just want to check how these options will impact, in this case, the argument. Okay. Now, for accuracy in this question type, you first want to figure out what the argument, in this case, Trevavas's argument is, right? So, what is this person's argument? We know that, just based on location, we know this person has spoken or said something twice in the passage, somewhere here and somewhere here, correct? Then you go through them quickly and you'll realize this is about the opinion. given here. If you notice here, according to Travers, the evidence that plants are agents, that they act purposefully, is indicated by numerous behaviors, mostly plasticity. Right? But this is about whether plants are agents or not. Notice here, argument is about plant intelligence, not about plants being agents. So I know this is not what we are looking for. We are looking for this. Here, his exact argument is that, let me just highlight it. And plant intelligence is defined as adaptively variable behavior during the lifetime of the individual, right? So X plant adapts in a variable fashion during its lifetime, correct? If we are to see a little bit above this, we make sure that this argument is perfectly known to you before you go to the options. This person says that, uh, just a moment. Right. So this behavior, plant intelligence as adaptively variable behavior during the lifetime of the individual, is separate from genetically determined developmental process. So this is not due to genetics. This is individual plant X actively adapts, actively behaves, and actively takes certain actions during its lifetime. So this is not due to genetics. Okay. So now if I want to weaken this, let's forget the options for a moment. If I want to weaken this, I want to create an option E, which will help me say, therefore, this idea, adaptively variable behavior during the lifetime of the individual, is false. Correct? This idea is false. This is what I'm trying to achieve with this question type, right? This is what we are trying to achieve when we are selecting an option with this question type. So let's go through each. Now, if true may, you'll have to learn to ignore a lot of the nonsense, such as research shows this ficus veridica plants. Okay, we'll just accept this as it is, we'll ignore it. Exhibit identical leaf growth patterns in both extreme sunlight and deep shade. Again, we'll just read this and ignore it with no variation. Correct? So these plants exhibit certain growth patterns in both extreme and deep shade with no variation. Correct. But this doesn't tell us whether these plants show, like, this is based on, let's say, let me explain this further. These, whatever these plants are, they behave in the same way during sunlight and deep shade, right? With no variation. This doesn't tell us whether variation was required here or not. Whatever these made up plants are, maybe they don't require this. Maybe it's just a thorny bush, right? Doesn't require any variation, just thorns. Doesn't require any variation. So we don't know. Look at option A as, even though the words no variation are used, I don't know if it will necessarily weaken this or not, right? So let's say unknown or neutral, doesn't impact the passage at all. Let's look at option B. New research shows that plant responses, including those of querulus regulus, are entirely genetically pre-programmed with no room for variability, right? So whatever this plant is, we'll ignore this also, this including those, this is not required. New research shows that plant responses, this applies to all plants. So that's why we can safely ignore this, right? Plant responses are entirely genetically pre-programmed. Matlab, adaptive, not there. Variable, not there. During the lifetime of the individual, not there. It's all genetically programmed. So B weakens the author's argument. I'll also explain to you why C and D are incorrect, but B weakens because B tells us it's entirely genetically pre-programmed. This is against this sentence. Let's look at C. Studies on these plants reveal that some of its root growth is completely random and bears no relation to soil moisture or survival. But this is talking about some of its root growth. And this is talking about one specific plant. Notice how option B was talking about plant responses in general. Notice how option C is simply talking about one plant ka one specific part to one specific degree. So obviously option C won't say that this entire thing is invalid. Option C is just saying For this plant, in this case, some of the roots don't show variation. This doesn't weaken this concept. So C is invalid, right? And D, evidence from this indicates that responses to herbivore attacks are purely chemical and almost fixed, with little adaptive change over time. Again, notice how here we are told that it's entirely genetically pre-programmed. Here it's saying almost fixed. Here it's saying little adaptive. So C and D don't follow. Option B is the correct choice. Is this clear to all of you? I know this question type is that's really great, Arup. Others also, please just pay attention to what I'm saying. Remember to simplify the question type before you actually jump into the question. If you simplify this question type, is going to be really useful for you to invest that time initially. What I just want to mention this about time quickly. What happens is we end up rushing to just one moment. We end up rushing to this and then these options too soon, right? Remember that if you're solving a question, we'll just randomly divide this in 2 minutes. Make sure that at least close to 50% of your time goes in first locating where you're trying to, go to, then simplifying what you're trying to figure out, and then go to the options. If you just spend most of your 2 minutes in a circular fashion on the options, then it's not useful to you, right? Okay. So keep this concept in mind. Let's try and solve one more question, and then we have an easy question after this. I'll just wait here. Please solve this question. All right. Others, please type in your answers. So let me first, okay. So let me just quickly define assumptions for everyone. Okay. This is important. So let me just do this. I know that many students already know what it is. Just remember this example. A tells B, go to the market and buy vegetables. All right. Now, this tells me that B knows the way to the market. correct? So this is a necessary assumption. When A tells B go to the market and buy vegetables, B knows the way to the market is a necessary and valid assumption. The reason why we know it's valid because the word the market was used here. So this tells us B knows the market A is talking about, right? So B knows the way to the market. So think of an assumption, if this is the passage, think of an assumption as a table, underlying argument, as a table on which the passage is standing on. If I say B does not know the way to the market, it's like kicking the legs off this table, the passage will fall down. This will stop making sense if I say B does not know the way to the market. Correct? So, valid assumption is something that is necessary for the passage to exist. If I add the word not to it, the passage will stop making sense. Keep this idea in mind, is going to be useful for you to solve assumption questions. You can revisit it later and pause and see it carefully if you want. Let's go through this. Which of the following assumptions is necessary to argue that applying the concept of agency provides valuable insights into behavior? So we know this is about this part of the passage, right? Why is agency important? What do we understand about the behavior of plants? If you notice here, agency, plants have agency. This is defined for us, right? Plants are agents, they act purposefully, they behave in a purposeful way, they show plasticity meaning flexibility or change over time, right? So, do plants have agency? This is given to us or explained to us using some example, right? Continuous long-term interaction is shown to us in one research case where uh, plant X was planted in one specific scenario, and in another specific scenario it reacted differently. This was dry environment, this was moist environment, it reacted differently. So therefore it proved to us X plant has agency. This is what this section was about. I just wanted you to invest, like I said, 50% of your time there and then go to the options. Let's look at A. By the way, this 50% is just my idea to tell you that invest enough time in it. Don't simply rush to the options. They can't be trusted. These are created as traps, right? Let's look at A. The concept of agency implies that plant responses are consciously directed towards specific goals or norms. So concept of agency implies that plant responses are consciously directed towards specific goals or norms. Consciousness is not discussed. Agency is discussed. Purposefully is discussed. But the idea of they are consciously directing this is not discussed. So this is a little problematic, right? We'll put this as a problematic thing. Let's look at B. Integrating philosophical perspectives such as agency is essential for deeper understanding of adaptive behaviors in plants. So philosophical perspectives such as agency helps us understand adaptive behaviors. So all of this helped us understand adaptive behaviors. So B sounds like a better option than option A. There is no uh, conflicting information or problematic information in option B. Let's confirm by eliminating option C and D. Remember, in the exam, always make sure that you eliminate your way to the right answer. If B sounds correct, don't simply mark it. C, may the notion of agency in plants requires that all adaptive behaviors be driven by a form of intentionality akin to human actions. This comparison of all adaptive behaviors are like human actions not made in the passage. So C is invalid, right? And then we are left with option D. Plants exhibit behaviors that are not unlike. Remember this. In the exam, there'll be at least one option where they'll use this double negative. This just means are like. ठीक है, plants exhibit behaviors that are like animal agency, making the concept of agency applicable across different organisms. So again, invalid, just like not related to human actions, different organisms invalid. So option B is the correct choice in this case. All right. So I explained to you what assumptions are. I explained to you how we locate that part of the passage, quickly go through it and simplify just the parts which are required. You don't have to go through this entire thing, right? We had read it before, so we sort of knew what sort of examples are given, what happens in one scenario, other scenario. We don't need the details such as this, correct? Then we went to the options, we found problematic words, and we found an option which does not present those problems. If you notice, if I remove this stool from under the passage, using the analogy for assumptions, if I say integrating philosophical perspectives such as agency is not essential, then this part of the passage, this connective part, stops making sense. Correct? So make sure that you use that understanding of assumptions. And I hope this is clear to you. Let's try and solve. I think I explained LB, I explained B again, but I'll tell you. Integrating philosophical perspectives such as agency, right? Intentionality, action, and purpose. What is intelligence? Can intelligence be considered as a philosophically sound concept when it comes to plants, right? This goes much further. Plant intelligence requires us to think of plants as agents, right? So the author is saying intelligence of plants is a philosophical concept. This integration of this philosophical concept of intelligence, such as agency, is necessary. Why is it necessary? This concept of agency, this concept of intentionality, action, and purpose helps us understand plants further, simply, right? This concept tells us whether plants are actually intelligent or not. So it helps us understand plants further. So that's why option B is the correct. If I added not here, the passage would stop making sense. That's why option B is the correct choice. All right. Now, quickly, one last question, and then I'll bring the class to an end, everyone. What is the main point of this passage? Please go through this, type in your answers. You don't have to hurry about it, just figure it out clearly. All right. Everyone, please type in your answers. All right. So let me once quickly explain one problem that students have with main point questions, right? I'd shown you what would be the ideal scenario for the main point. Ideal scenario would be intelligence in plants, perfectly possible to provide definitions of intelligence, like multiple definitions could exist that apply to multiple types of plant behavior. Agency pakdo, then intentionality pakdo, XYZ, right? Adaptability. So this is the, let's say, close to ideal main point of the author. Now, what I want you to remember is in the exam, the examiner will never give us an ideal choice, right? You get, at least in most cases, if we are very lucky, we'll get an ideal option, but usually nahi aata. So we get imperfect options. We want to figure out which of them is closest to the main point of the author, right? So let's look at option A. Plants are agents that act autonomously. This is stated in the passage, by the way, right? To achieve goals in their environment, stated in the passage. So correct fact, but not the main point. Main point is why the author spoke to us. We need to know why the author spoke to us. The author spoke to us to tell us, are plants intelligent? Can we consider plants as intelligent? Right? This would require us to redefine some philosophical terms. Correct? So option A does not capture the author's main point. Option C says agency in plants challenges traditional definitions of intelligence, good, and central nervous systems. So, agency in plants does not challenge our understanding of central nervous systems. This is factually incorrect. So, if you notice, option C was correct till here. This made option C incorrect, right? This is option A is incorrect because it just states facts, not the main point. And we are left with option D, plants' responses to stimuli highlight the need for more research on their behavior. This is not discussing the main point of the author, and therefore option D is also incorrect. Option B, redefining intelligence is necessary, right? We need to redefine some of it to understand plant behavior as adaptive. This is the correct choice in this case. All right. Is this clear to everyone? Okay. So, I've extended beyond the necessary timeline for the class. So I want to bring the class to an end, but I just want to tell you a few things. One is I'll be holding this class next Friday also. So do leave some comments which tell me how I can make any improvements or changes to it so that it's specifically more, conditioned for your needs in the coming time. Maybe, 30, 40 days, you want to make some changes to your solving process. So do ask those questions and I'll make those changes. So that's it for today. We'll discuss these type of questions in the days to come. All right. Thank you for being patient. I know these classes, especially when the text is of this small, this on the screen, are very difficult to watch. But it's something that you'll have to practice because you have to read online for the exam anyway on a screen, right? So thank you everyone for participating, and I'll see you next Friday, right? Thank you and good night. So just a moment. Next session is next Friday, sir. Main idea, should we focus more on what's specified in the first paragraph and last paragraph? Rishabh, I don't like to be formulaic about these things. I can find maybe next weekend, next Friday, I can find a passage where the main point is not just given in the first or the last paragraph. Maybe it's given somewhere in between. They're not common, but you can find passages like that. So don't be formulaic. Just figure out the main point of the author. Aru asked that question in the comments, and I'll discuss this in the next class next Friday, right? So thank you, everyone. I'll bring the class to an end. Thank you and good night. I'll see you next weekend. Thank you.